Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have two superb poets with us today, Lee Rossi and Doren Robbins. Lee will read first and then Doren. I quote, "Not exactly a red diaper baby, Lee Rossi has long been attracted to radical solutions to societal problems. In college, he joined the SDS and frequented various demonstrations and protests. Dow Chemical, the March on Washington. Favorite authors included Karl Marx and Herbert Marcuse. His heroes were MLK and Malcolm X. Like many folks who survived the 70s, Lee realized that the 80s were headed in the wrong direction. With Reagan at the helm, the ship of state had turned around and was heading aground. And now we find ourselves on the beach at Mar-a-Lago. Today, he would like to share with you a few poems couched in the cynicism and despair he feels about our current political predicament. Here's an outstanding poet, Lee Rossi.
Hey, Harry. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here with you and your audience. Okay, so I'm going to issue a little trigger warning here at the beginning. My poems are going to contain political and historical information that you may have forgotten or may never have been acquainted with, but you know, it's what's been forcing me actually to deal with our current political emergency. I think it's probably clear to everyone why a person of color might commit him or herself to the struggle for social justice, but why someone like me, a boy from the lily-white suburbs of St. Louis, why did I become an ardent supporter of the rights of Black people, but not just Black people, women, Asian Americans, immigrants, and people of non-conforming sexuality? I don't think there's any simple answer, but maybe the following poems can begin to suggest some of the answers. My first few poems grow out of my childhood in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, during the 1950s, part of the first generation of white flight. Of course, it was also the heyday of the Cold War, and this first poem meditates on that alarming circumstance. It's called 1955, 12 Miles from Ground Zero. We didn't have much education, 8 grades for mom and dad, even fewer for me, but we read all the time, the Daily Globe, Time, and US News. Every week, another article on the nuclear threat. With Russia only 30 minutes over the horizon, we'd have almost no warning before 50 megatons vaporized downtown. And with downtown only 12 miles away, who knew if we'd be vapor too? I knew, of course, having studied the diagram, downtown the center of the target, concentric rings spreading out into the cities and suburbs, the houses, parks, grass and trees, the animals and pets, the schools filled with thoughtful children. We'd survive, I decided, radioactive perhaps, glowing with a plutonium tan, but only if the Russians could hit what they were aiming at. In the meantime, I checked out our fruit cellar, the jars of pickles and peach preserves, rank on rank, what we'd have to eat and drink after the firestorm. Okay, so that was 1955. I was, I guess, 8 or 9 years old. But then suddenly was 1956, the year of the Hungarian Revolution. And I'm still living in the white suburbs of Missouri. But later, I enrolled at Cornell University, among whose famous habitués were Thomas Pynchon, the novelist, and Vladimir Nabokov, refugee, novelist, and butterfly enthusiast. This poem is called Born Too Late, or The Rise and Fall of American Bandstand. I hope you remember American Bandstand. Okay. Pynchon was 16 when he entered Cornell. It was 1953. The Korean War suddenly over. Mr. Potato Head still big with kids. I spent hours Christmas morning building an aircraft carrier, flying its 3 tiny planes on sorties over the Korean peninsula, bombing bridges, strafing commies. 2 years later, Pynchon was in the Navy, and then in 56, on board a destroyer heading for Suez. I was out back, tossing clods of dirt at the chicken house, like the freedom fighters in Budapest. The next year, Pynchon was back at Cornell, uphill from Ithaca Gun, studying Russian literature with a famous Russian emigre, literary assassin stalking American Puritanism, voluptuous and blonde. That man's father murdered by another Russian emigre. Nabokov always said he didn't remember the kid, but Vera, his wife, did. The kid's funny writing, half script, half print. I was sitting in our living room like one of Plato's cave dwellers, letting shadows wash over me, lip syncing like the singers on Bandstand. Philadelphia, the friendly place, was more real than my own backyard. And then Pynchon, descendant of the founder of Springfield, Mass., Armory of the Union, graduated. Later, he wrote, "If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers." The lepidopterist was gone too, who'd written, "You can always count on a murderer for a fancy prose style." I'd get there a few years later. Meantime, I'd learned to dance like they did in Philly, but folk music had just arrived, and soon I was sitting at a tiny table, sipping a Coke, tapping my foot, almost ready to march against the next war. Before I knew it, yes, I was an adolescent, terrible time, and had to choose a high school. Being Catholic and knowing that my immortal soul would be in constant peril if I went to a co-ed school, I chose the all-male seminary. This next poem recounts one particular outing with a group of fellow seminarians during the 1964 presidential campaign, when we went to hear the Republican candidate for president. You remember who that was. Poem's called Young Americans for Freedom. That later became the name of a group of right-wing conservatives. Young Americans for Freedom. There we were, 4 or 5 seminarians in the back of the auditorium, almost spilling over the lip of the mezzanine, waiting for the man of the moment to appear. He was a Jew, and we his sworn enemies. Politics makes strange bedfellows, that's what I was told. And before we'd lose our country to godless communists, we'd make allies of the devil and his spawn. That sounded okay to me, although I'd never met an atheist, much less a communist. The devil, however, was familiar, a constant companion, always urging me to take another path, constantly pointing out how narrow the high wire I trod, how deep the drop. I stared at the hats, the nets, the bald spots below me. The music crescendoed, and there he was, the senator from Arizona, polished, patrician, silver-haired, tribune of the gainfully retired, refugees from the snow belt, its frostbite and cinders. We are surrounded by enemies, he told us, not just in Asia and Europe, but in our own country. People who would take our homes and businesses, take away our beliefs. Troublemakers who wanted to sit next to us at lunch counters, who would force us to accept them as equals. Freedom is a gift we have to protect from those jealous of our freedoms. I'd learned enough about the virtue of selfishness to know that taxes are bad, that government saps your moral strength. Delilah clipping Samson's hair. We'd been taught to look in the mirror and see Satan. We had so many names for evil: beatniks and homosexuals, secularism and civil rights, the UN, the Federal Reserve. So many lions, so few Daniels. Water cannons and police dogs weren't enough. Not riot police, nor even Bull Connor spitting into a bullhorn. When would we realize that all our weapons would never save us? Not until we declared war on America. So, war. I grew up with war, and I thought about war constantly, surrounded by war. And everywhere as I turned as a kid was war. The next war was already underway. It had a number of names. The Second Indo-Chinese War, or what we called it, Vietnam. I guess there were other names for it. Happily, I was a spectator in that war, superbly positioned to watch its desperate ending. 2 days ago, March 4th, 2025, was the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. Here's a poem which recounts that fateful day, along with an unusual turmoil in my own private life at the time. It's called May Day, 1975. May Day also is universal code for distress. Somewhere, one war was ending, helicopters rising from the roofs of buildings and spilling refugees like loose change, while another war was blindly chipping away at its prison with an egg tooth. I was half a world away, sitting in the Schlosspark, this was in Germany, and hoping for a visit from one of Rilke's angels. Despite its name, there was no castle, only a blank space in the middle of the city, all that was left for the children of the firestorm. I watched shoppers hurrying like Aeneas into Hades and resurfacing from a cavernous underground grocery with the heads of Demeter and Eurydice in string bags. And I wondered what the sudden beauty of the sky, clouds like bolsters and feather beds lazing on a mattress all watery blue, had to do with the uncharacteristic optimism flooding me like snowmelt. Somewhere it was still winter, the wind's serrated teeth gnawing granite and gneiss, but here the cherry trees unfurled their fragrant labia. And then across the vast green, I saw a friend. He was drunk and depleted, a soldier who'd emptied his clip into the jungle, frightened by something he couldn't see. I could go home now and find my wife alone for the first time in days. I had given away something I didn't want and now would have to take it back. But I waited. Every year, spring arrives with its promise of less. I waited for the angel to appear, waited until the nimbus surrounding everything faded, and I was free to step into a future that even then was becoming my past. Okay, a few more. Let's jump into the Wayback Machine. Here's a poem that tries to imagine what it was like for my grandfather as a young lad growing up in the hills of northern Italy at a time when the newly formed Italian nation was trying, like every other European nation, to build an African empire. It's called a wooden gun. They gave me a wooden gun and taught me to shoot, though I already knew how. They taught me to sight along the barrel, although I could kill a rabbit at 50 yards. They taught me to brace my elbow against my side for stability, just like my father had taught me when I was 10. They taught me to squeeze the trigger slowly and pretend that I felt a recoil. They taught me to pretend that I could see blood blossom on a target. They taught me to march, putting my left foot in front of my right and then the right in front of the left, just as I had done since I learned to walk. They taught me to dig a hole and put my shit in it. They taught me to dig a deeper hole and put myself in it. They taught me to pretend that I could hear an incoming artillery shell and duck my head in time. They taught me to salute and say, "Yes, Sergeant." I said, "Yes, Sergeant," louder and more quickly than anyone else in the platoon. They taught me to fold my kit and make my bed so tight the sergeant could bounce a quarter off it as if it were a trampoline for quarters. They taught me to polish my shoes, to spit and polish until they gleamed like a cloudless night high in the mountains. They taught me not to think, but only to obey. Yes, Sergeant. Yes, Colonel. Yes, Papa. Yes, Prime Minister. I was just a boy, but I was a good student. Eventually, I made it to the West Coast, California, Gold Mountain. But my father had already gotten there as an MP in the WW2, the big one. He traveled a lot between Texas, where he was a drill instructor, and Oakland, California, where the freshest cannon fodder was shipped off to the Pacific War. On his way back to Texas, he'd strap on his service revolver and escort Japanese Americans to a concentration camp in Texas. This next poem is a request for forgiveness for my father. It's called The Ultimate Family Adventure. Are you ready for a change of pace? When was the last time your family experienced something truly different? Just one BART stop from SFO, nestled at the foot of majestic Mount San Bruno, Camp Rising Sun for the whole family. Once upon a time, it was Tanforan Racetrack, and later the Tanforan Assembly Center, home to thousands of Japanese Americans. Now, your friends at the friendliest camp on the peninsula are making it possible for you to experience the full range of activities available only to people of Japanese descent during World War II. Wake with the sunrise, sleep when the sun goes down. Camp Rising Sun offers an experience of history unlike any on the West Coast. Those of you who've lived in Monticello's slave quarters and worked its fields now know how thrilling a change of pace can be. CRS, Camp Rising Sun, offers authentic meals, rice twice daily, sprinkled with seaweed and hot ocha, green tea, and classes in traditional arts. Become adept at sumie, calligraphy, and ikebana, flower arranging. But first, you'll be clearing debris discarded by your fellow vacationers, and for the more robust, opportunities to demonstrate your construction skills, building roads and walkways. You'll love squeezing the whole family, all 6 of you, into a stall in one of our converted stables. Everyone gets their own straw tick and blanket. A memorable night is promised for all. Life at Camp Rising Sun reminds you you're never far from nature. The smell of horse manure, the whitewashed corpses of insects offering texture to the hastily erected walls. Younger folks can take classes in karate and learn to grow vegetables. As is usually the case, there are more latrines for men than women. In fact, men can choose between facilities for gents and colored gents. Camp Rising Sun goes out of its way to offer historical accuracy. The guard's uniform in an interesting historical twist, the guards are all descendants of the original internees. Their uniforms authentically reproduce military police gear. Be aware that, as in the original camp, hot water runs out by 9 in the morning. Those who need to do laundry should get up by 3 a.m. There's a dusk to dawn curfew, by the way, which is observed mostly in violation. Be sure to enjoy North Lake, a fish pond designed and built by the earliest generation of campers. Don't worry about having time on your hands. The Army Corps of Engineers has left plenty for you to do, and yet you'll love the leisurely pace of camp life, the long, slow-moving lines for the latrines, the showers, and the mess. You'll want to come back year after year. Okay, and then my last poem is a survey, I guess you could say, of the current social and political scene, but it could just as well be a description of any moment in the past 78 years. The title is the first word of the poem. It's the only economical title in the whole bunch. It's called Dystopia. Dystopia is what's left after the Great Flood. That and promise. The bodies of the drowned littering the beach, which is everything. Have you prayed for sunshine? Do you remember the name of that flower, red, 5-petaled, with prickles instead of thorns, that used to greet you each morning as you rose from your bed? Whose plant are you? What soil awaits your return? An island with its queen? An ungainly boy who only looks like you? Who will imagine your return? You who have destroyed that possibility, raising cities, fouling the sky with your boasts. The dead will not sing your name, but will flee into the rivers, into the soil. You wanted peace, you said, the peace of a forest at midnight when wolves and lions stalk the unwary. And now even the wolves, the lions are gone. You're doing, fording the rivers, leaping the hills, finding enemies wherever you went. This is your victory, this mud of which you are made. So thank you.
Thank you, Lee. That was fabulous. Your conscience, your sense of morality, the historical, social context that you grew up with and that you helped move through time and let us know about all that. How is your style and content changed since you were a young poet?
Oh, good question, Harry. I tried to be, I think, more lyrical when I was younger. I tried to, the poets I would mimic back then would be people like Merwin or maybe Galway Connell. But as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate poets like Alan Dugan, who writes a lot about history and social class, and so I think my topics have changed, and my writing has become a little more, I won't say prosaic, but a little more marked with the language of bureaucracy and prose.
Yeah, I noticed that the clarity you have and the narrative strength you have and the focus on the subject matters that you talked about today, it gives a larger scope to your body of work. And so I really appreciate that. And you see things with such clarity. And tell us a little bit about, just briefly, your movement through education and how you got into poetry. I remember a little bit about it, but when did you really start writing poetry in a serious, regular way? How old?
Well, I was always attracted to poetry beginning in high school. I had a friend in high school who was also thought of himself as a poet. And, we would trade poems, and we were really quite awful and self-absorbed. And so it started there, and then for the next 30 years, 25 years, I would write 2 or 3 poems a year, and I not really have much to show for my efforts. But then suddenly, as I approached 40, I realized that I needed to get serious, and I took a class with your pal and mine, Jack Grapes, and Jack, of course, is this wonderful closet formalist. He will show you many different ways of arranging words and sentences in poems, and I took that to heart. And for the first, I would say 10, 15 years of writing, I'm nearly 80 now, so I've been writing almost 40 years. For the first 10, 15 years, I was just constantly playing with all the different possibilities that Jack had opened to me. I read a lot as well, so and I find lots of different things that I like, so I try to imitate that. Whoever happens to appeal it to me at the moment, and so constantly learning. I never say that I'm done, and I know exactly who I am as a poet. I'm constantly delving into the substrate and trying to come up with something new.
It seems to me you've really, on a writing level, there's a distilled clarity and beauty in your work and a fluency and a larger scope than, not that your work before was lesser, it's just a different style and a different focus. But, I love your poetry. I love what you read. You've always contributed not only to your own work, but to the larger community of poetry with your reviews and also your care for your fellow poet. So thank you very much, Lee Rossi, for just a wonderful reading. It's always a pleasure to see you and hear what you're up to these days. And I really, it's pretty amazing what you're doing right now. So thank you, Lee Rossi. And now our next poet is Doren Robbins. Over the years, Doren Robbins' writing has appeared in many periodicals, including Kayak, Sulphur, the American Poetry Review, Hotel America, the Iowa Review, Lana Turner, and Salt. His current book, Sympathetic Manifesto, which I love, Selected Poems 1975 to 2015, published in 2021, is out of print. There are a few copies available from the author at Robbins Doren at fhda.edu. As a poet and an artist, Robbins organized readings and produced posters to benefit the Romero Relief Fund and the Salvadoran Medical Relief Fund during the Salvadoran Civil War, and for poetsagainstwar.com at the beginning of the American-Iraq-Afghanistan wars. He taught literature and creative writing at Foothill College, 2001 to 2022. Here's a brilliant poet, Doren Robbins.
Thank you, Harry, for that inspiring introduction. I had something else set up to do, but I want to dedicate a poem to Lee for his commitment and his work. It just occurred to me while he was reading that I wanted to give this poem to him. It's from this book here, from the selected poems that you mentioned, and it's a poem that is inspired by the Turkish poet Nazım Hikmet. He was a communist poet, but beyond that labeling, he was just a great, humane individual and passionate man. And one of the reasons for my dedication to his work and to try to keep his name alive is that he basically spent close to 30 years in prison for being a revolutionary because his books were considered books that were inspiring a rebellion in Turkey, especially amongst the Turkish soldiers. So this is a poem that I wrote years ago and then revised for the selected poems. And I fantasize his relationship with his wife, they stayed true to each other. They had a great love, Vera. And it's called To the Veras, to Nazim Hikmet. The stove and Vera stirring the broth in his mind, in the prison cell hut of his blood. You figure out your own light company in there. You see the stove without the name of a country stamped on it. Somebody's making an ode to broth on that burner, or an ode to cast iron, or to the clay of China, to brick and mortar, to the clothes you live in, the stove that will do, all the way to Guantanamo, because Guantanamo updates him. The ode is to Vera's thick hand, lifting the ladle, private in a husband's fantasy or a wife's fantasy, a bone broth prison fantasy, ode to Vera, setting down the soup bowl and the common fact of dipping the spoon, a poet making the inquiries, dipping a spoon to the phrase of musical immediacy, Django Reinhardt sullen or sweet Jim Hall. To the plant life of the mind, some poets water into a salvaged mood. To the surge at the end, half of what's rare, undefined until the end. Ode to the prisoner working in there. The sensations and fantasy life in there, 20 years after getting locked up for a book of poems, accused of inciting the Turkish people to revolt, that it were true for us now. The easily deceived and betrayed, he said we wrote for. Whatever subway or bus stop you wait at, you just have to look around. Okay, so I had some things planned from the selected and new poems, but I received this in the mail. It's a new book, and it's called Itinerant Dreamer. And there's a better with the not for resale image here of the front cover. It's a collage and photo montage titled Rocking Horse Archetype. The book is called Itinerant Dreamer. It's going to be out in June. And it's really a collage of genres. There's poems in it that are previously published in the selected poems. There's a couple of new poems, particularly a long poem called Under the World's Leadership. There's a lot of shopping carts, it takes off from a Ginsberg poem, Under the World. There's a lot of ass. Nothing to despair about in terms of the ongoing vulgarity that Ginsberg uses in the poem. He uses it appropriately, but I went in another direction. In this book, though, there's, as I said, it's a kind of a conglomeration of genres, a collage of genres, and I work in collage quite a bit. And so, for example, the cover, this is the title, collage. I don't know if these things can come out good here. It doesn't look too great. All right, so I'm going to move along with this. Part of this first section, though, has a lot to do with introspection. This is a piece, it's hard to see, I know, introspection, not the quality. So I'm going to read a poem which is, for me, deeply connected with my own personal introspection. I have a lot of quarrels with metaphor as compared to what I understand, and I guess many people understand as enigma, in which something metaphorical to me is being evoked, but it's not in the form of a metaphor. The language takes on a different type of meaning, possibly symbolic, I don't know. I tend to look at it, though, as enigmatic meaning. So the title of the poem is Cloth of Cilantro, which to me is not a metaphor. It's simply the cloth of cilantro. I'm taking up the pearls of cloth one more time. For a change, I'm doing it without any losses. I'm starting with the cloth of cilantro, with the stain of it on my fingers, the ripe smell of the unfurled part moistening the edges of my nails. I need the most mute processes now. I need the pile of dirt that does not glow with anything. I'm starting with the fragrant underground and the sucked out skin of the green rims dropped off there. I take up the young cilantro, so much like pearl, where the pearl is floral, and so much like leaf, where the leaf is secreted within my human cells. You can keep your garden. I take up the branch that lives in two atmospheres, and I let it do with me what it wants. So, moving along through Itinerant Dreamer, I was also deeply connected. I mentioned Nazim Hikmet, but I also have a deep connection with the German Jewish poet Paul Celan. Now, a lot of his poems are somewhat obscure, speaking of truly being the enigmatic of the enigmatic. But he does have many poems which still maintain a type of a narrative without being the more typical lyric narrative that I think many of us got bored by around the time the language poets came around, not to celebrate them more than they deserve. But I know that there was an extreme impatience with the lyric narrative for a long time now, the whole last century, really, beginning with Gertrude Stein, you could say. But anyways, for me, I walked into a bookstore, Ingalls Used Bookstore in Berkeley in around 1972, and I picked up Jerome Rothenberg's translations of the new German poets. And there's about 20 poets in there. And I opened to Paul Celan's poem, Todesfuge, which is the Black Milk of Morning, I call it, poem. And it's beyond elegy. It's really a commemoration of what happened in World War II, particularly to the Jews in the concentration camps, wherein both of his parents were killed and he survived. It's ridiculous as Adorno's statement is about poetry not being possible after the Holocaust. To me, and I assume with Paul Celan and Jerome Rothenberg and others, never was it more necessary to write poetry than after the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is, even though it's singular, it's part of a tradition of historical facts, because we're a history of Holocausts to a variety of people. It's just that one seems to have been, up to this point, possibly the most sinister. So there's a bit of a memoir in here on my experience with Celan, and then I did a series of drawings that were inspired by Jean Davy's book on Celan. And he has this fantastic line where he was with Celan, and he wrote this line where he said that his arms end in hands he keeps clenched. And, this is like the beginning of this section where it's a graphite drawing of those hands. And then it goes on with a sequence of fantasized mourners for Paul Celan. They're fantasized. These are not literal people. These are people that came to my mind as I read the book and contemplated, not even consciously. It was almost against my will, which is sometimes the best time to create. Maybe my favorite mourner is this mourner, kind of a dream mourner. Hard to see a little bit. So anyways, I'm going to read this poem. I never read it, mainly because I don't think anybody should be congratulated for commemorating a catastrophe. It just has to be written. So I never liked the idea of reading the poems I've written about the Holocaust or certain elegies, because it almost betrays the nature of why I wrote them. But I'm going to read this one. I'm going to dedicate it to Paul Celan's memory. Now, around the time I wrote this poem, as an artist, I was also studying, again, Hieronymus Bosch's works, particularly The Temptation of St. Anthony, because in terms of his historical vision, the madness of humanity, not just stimulated by the plagues, but I believe about what he saw around him as an artist and as a man, were extremely perplexing to him. And it really is a fantasy of purgatory on some level, or even beyond that, Hieronymus Bosch's Temptation of St. Anthony. So he comes up in the poem. Jew dog, I turn the page with my tongue to study an enlargement of the frog and two small armored dogs. I study the fury with a jawbone of nails pressing behind them. My nose moistens over the pet devil guarding a nun. I turn the page to study the painted layers of a knight's armor and the mast of a boat with a cargo of hands. I'm licking the paint for the last time, looking at Hieronymus Bosch for the last time, looking at St. Anthony and the virgin blood in the human-sized frog's cup for the last time. I lick the shrubs where the dogs came through, erasing them, erasing the painted table and the painted path, erasing the cleaver and bowls prepared for the dog's meat. I'm chewing on Alan Resnay's celluloid, the plumber who puts in the gas line, not a water line to the showers, goes down in the acids of my saliva, cursing Jews. The celluloid cracks around my eyelids. I lick off the smoldering edges. I lick the paint off an idiot's head. I lick the paint of the pet devil for the last time. I erase the painted egg it produced. I lick the closed door of the tiled room and the leather sweatband of a helmet a guard left against the door jamb. I lick the German conductor's fingers. They smell of dumplings and vaginal juice. I lick the threshold of the door where the music carries you away. But they went off already, the procession of Jews. The armored dogs too are going. The get-up they're in won't matter. I'm looking at the winged executive for the last time. I run at the legs of a girl, the color of ripened limes. I do it so she'll get out of here if she doesn't know. I watch him land on the table where she sleeps. I watch him and the guards preparing the lime-colored one for the last time. He's taking her bladder to transplant for his pet Rottweiler. He's taking her hair for the heads of his upholstered dolls. His legs reach across the room. I watch him jar the bladder in the preparation solution. I watch him fold the hair down for the last time. Looking into her open skin, he says, I do not have roses. I do not need roses, but you are a lime wrapped in a rose. You must pay for your rose. Have you forgotten? Nothing but hair rolled by hand into separate stacks. Nothing but French ants, German ants, Croatian and Ukrainian ants carrying their packages of hair away. Nothing but contracts and papers signed, helmet liner contracts, little death carts of hair. Nothing but weaponry salesmen departing for the Mid-East. I'm licking her feet. I'm washing the lime-colored one's feet, staring down at the linoleum of Portland, sweating into the booth, eating in there, writing and pausing. Nothing but a Jew's dream. Okay, and then following that, there's a collage, it's Inventory Auschwitz, and it's hard to discern, but there's what's happening in there. Let me see if I can get this. Nah, it's impossible to get it to look right. But it's over one of those piles of eyeglasses, like the eyeglasses they collected in Cambodia when people were being arrested, thinking that if you could read, that you were a threat to the state. We wonder what Trump comes out of. He comes out of history. To switch the mood here a minute, I want to read a love poem. Okay, it's called The Sexiest Part. And again, it follows a work of art here. You can see it's an abstraction of a couple, and it's actually the actual work, but before it was framed, it's just kind of leaning up in my studio there, surrounded by a bunch of materials. And it's a commemoration of my first kiss with my wife of 41 years. The sexiest part. The sexiest part is the way she clipped a two-year-old's fingernails with patience. The sexiest part is the way she read at night to our abandoned 3-year-old nephew. And when he finally slept, she made actual plans, either to adopt or abduct him, because his younger mother was cruel and didn't care that she was. The sexiest part, that she still took her stepniece and stepdaughter for notebooks and pencils, took them into the Natural History Museum and to the park with the struggling tire swing, and to see the Mermaid movie and all that, although almost everyone in the family tried to divide us for 5 years. Our life together is my fetish, my connection, my lucky fit. The sexiest part is the unpredictable switch in her stance, which I relate to a mare in heat I saw once when they led a stallion around to the other side of a corral until later. The sexiest part is that she is not sexy. She is mild in a way that protects the exotic aura about her. The sexiest part is when my face washes out and her face washes over it, and we rest on the side of her hair. The sexiest part is the powerless magic of not parting, but magic nonetheless. Then there's a sequence in here. I wrote an essay. It's related to Jack London's The Iron Heel, which is a powerful political novel, the style of which I don't care for at all. It's not London's best writing, in my opinion. If you like London at all, I mean, I'm close to London, admittedly, because of his humane politics and his sense of adventure, but his humane politics. So I did a series called the Iron Heel Sequence. And what I did is I took the cover of the book, which has this heel again, and I apologize for the quality here, but it's a sequence of photo montages, mixed media works, focusing on the poor and the massacred of recent times. And it's followed by a poem from the selected poems, which has been slightly revised, called Gregor Samsa's Face. Now, there was a period in my life, 2 different times where I did blue-collar work. Very dignified group of people I worked with each time, along with sleazy people too. But it was in the restaurant business and as a cook, and then later as a carpenter. And as a carpenter, sometimes we went to work in some pretty rough places as maintenance people when that's the only work that was available. And you went in there and you gave people good deals. Anyways, I'm obsessed with Kafka somewhat, but particularly like many people with the metamorphosis and really what he's trying to get at there by turning a human being into a bug. Gregor Samsa's face. Nabokov went so far as to make diagrams of the fictional apartment Gregor Samsa lived in as an insect, but sketched no details of Gregor Samsa's face. Why he didn't? He had his reasons. It couldn't have been a pleasant face, that insectization of a man's lips, for instance, and we too would turn away from his mouth, the way we turned from the dog's lick after yelling at him for nosing what some other dog left behind. And there is something of a man being only worthy of garbage, and Gregor Samsa turned into an insect. I used to enter that world and run down apartments when we worked in maintenance. Some tenants offered us drinks in glasses not uncleaned, but smeared from so much ground into them. Glasses they couldn't replace, drinks they really couldn't afford to offer, or any of us to refuse. Driving back, you would see the sage scrub above Highway 1, where the insect people had come from the colder cities to live in the open. Gregor Samsa's face is the frozen face I saw in a subway dwelling, a face with hard red hair, like Van Gogh's face of an injured saint or fool that all men are who have beards, like the beard I imagine on Kafka's character, and who don't know how to stop themselves from getting swindled. As for Gregor Samsa, a man's beard caught on fire, and before they were evacuated, 3 others came to warm themselves. Okay, let me stop with one poem, one last new poem, short poem called Recovered From. There's a naive exhilarance to a person writing down a dream, the manner he felt less subtracted. Wait a second. I dreamed I was an infant dreaming. What did I know? All I knew, the one thing I clung to, the reprieves coming my way. I wasn't even aware I needed them. I didn't see a reception. I can't explain the favoritism. I don't understand the whim of procedure at all. I estimated the weight. I observed a fantasy of the sexes, the color gradations, separate leg lengths, how the designs were arranged, the patterns, the hyperluminous differential gray day moths forcing down a Oaxaca sage petal, the floating pollen table, driven to where they were going, close as I'll get to nature today, close as I'll get to the rose gray ardent grain. I dreamed I was an infant dreaming, close as I'll get to a breast or a shoulder today. Had all the time I needed one time. I struggled. I raised my fists against something, a curtain, a crow's shadow, plumbago without blossoms, ragged twine. then relaxed my arms, then relaxed my fat. My entire face squinted in privacy, using a sort of breast of my left hand as a sort of pillow. Thank you for the time to share my work with you guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Doren, for such a superlative reading. It was erudite, eloquent, transcendent, and compassionate, among other things. And, you know, I can see why you were a brilliant teacher. You just have such a learnedness about you, and you express it in just such fluency. So thank you for that. And, you know, we have about a minute left. So why don't you, Doren, and I just take about 30 seconds, and then Lee the same about each other's poetry.
Comment on each other?
Yeah, Doren, just take about 30 seconds and say what you think about, you know, in a brief way, Lee's poetry, and then Lee says something in the same.
Oh, well, yeah, to me, it's very easy. It's the main reason that I was spontaneously inspired to read my Nazim Hikmet poem, because I have a special allegiance with the community, international community, and particularly in the United States, because I too am the son of a veteran. And I was raised a permanently disabled veteran who couldn't talk about it until he was 81.
Wow.
And then the tears streamed down his face for a week of talking about it to me. And when I was up for the draft for the Vietnam War, and I was absolutely against the war and basically terrified of being killed or having to kill someone, my father looked at me and said, "Son, you will never go to war." And that was it.
Doren, thank you very much. Lee, I'm sorry we ran out of time. We have a next show coming on at 2:00. And as they say, television waits for no man or no woman. But I love both of your reading. They're really transcending for both of your visions and your wonderful writing. Next Tuesday, we have two fabulous poets with us, Laurel Ann Bogan and David Oliveira. And that will be our 250th show.
Wow.
So thank you once again.
Congratulations.
Lee Rossi and Doren Robbins. And here's our great director, Jennifer Clymer.
I also want to add congratulations. Your 250th show is a huge milestone, and congratulations. I hope everyone who's tuned in today tunes in next week as well. You're welcome to stick around. Cinephiles is up next, but I just want to thank Lee and Doren for being here as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.